Thanks everyone for dialing in for this month's seminar. I'm Len Witherspoon, once part of the leadership team for QuakeCoRE, and I got the pleasure of introducing our speaker for this month, which is Richard Smith, and he's going to talk about the Natural Hazards and Resilience platform. I don't think Richard needs too much introduction from most of us, but he's provided a very nice bio, so I thought I would read it out. So Richard's got a hybrid background in research facilitation, disaster risk reduction policy and practice, and natural hazard research, naturally linked to the platform we're going to hear about. Most recently, he was the director of the RNC, the Resilience to Nature Challenges National Science Challenge, which wrapped up in the middle of last year. And before that, he was at EQC NHC when it was called EQC, really focusing on the resilience strategy. Before that, he was at McDem, looking at policy and capability development and science advice. And he sometimes, I can't remember the word you describe yourself from your link back to your academic days, Richard, but he's got a PhD from geological sciences from UC and was at the University of Waikato as a senior lecturer on earth science. So really great to have Richard here, and I'll pass it over to you to run through the presentation today.
Thanks, Liam. Appreciate that. I think the term you're looking for is failed academic. Kia ora. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining the session this morning. I hope it's a useful distraction for you on a Friday. Really great to be here. I think this is the third seminar, actually, that I've given for QuakeCoRE. And I wanted to start with an acknowledgement of somebody who's not here, David, who'll be very familiar to, I'm guessing, probably most of you, if not all of you, and I guess particularly poignant given the kind of the shared involvement in QuakeCoRE and the resilience challenge before and at the early stages of the platform. And I know his loss is very deeply felt amongst colleagues and friends still. So just want to acknowledge David in the context of where we're at with the emergence, I guess, of the new platform and his contribution. So I'm going to assume that many of you will have had some involvement or at least some awareness of the process underway to establish the new platform. I'll talk a bit about what a platform is and some key features. And given the mostly research audience, I'm guessing, with QuakeCoRE, focus in on where we've landed with the kind of high-level themes for the science programs, but also the enabling functions, and also speak to some opportunities, I guess, that there are for connection, engagement, and participation over the next wee while, and what we see as the trajectory, I guess, for the platform after this sort of first stage of establishment. And I guess there's a key message here that we're kind of building on this legacy or a whakapapa of collaborative, multidisciplinary research focused on this mission of natural hazards resilience. And in fact, the funding that was granted for this new platform, much of the justification for it was the recognition of the critical need for science capability in this area and working on this as a national challenge, if you like, or mission. But it goes back beyond the national science challenges of the last 10 years to what was really the first attempt to bring some stable funding and a collaborative culture to this domain of the system, the natural hazards research platform. So the language has shifted slightly back to the future in a way, but the makeup and the arrangements, but also kind of where the science has got to, the nature of the collaborations, I think, has evolved through the last 15 years or so. So very much drawing on the collective legacy, I guess, of the science contribution capability and the partnerships that have emerged. Along the bottom there is just a kind of informal reference, I guess, to some key events which have taking place during that similar time frame. And the very first platform, Natural Hazards Platform, had its kind of baptism of fire in a way as a way of mobilising science and support of response and recovery through the Canterbury earthquake sequence, the start of the Resilience National Science Challenge, and I know this was also the case for QuakeCoRE and its participants, the Kaikoura, the North Canterbury earthquakes at the end of 2016, and then the recovery that followed. And then we've had all these other multiple hazard events as well, and the science capability in these structures and mechanisms, including QuakeCoRE, have been really critical to supporting local, regional, national responses. And we can anticipate that there'll be more of these events. We're seeing repeat severe weather impacts just over the last few weeks. And in recognition of that, the new platform, and I'll speak in a little bit of detail about this, is being asked to take on a more formal role in providing coordination support for the science that's needed when big events happen and communities are disrupted. Just stepping back, this will be hopefully familiar context for many of you, but just wanted to set the scene about what this thing is. Platform is a term that's used loosely and formally in a number of different ways. What it means in the context of this is the funding mechanism through MB. So it's government funding through what it calls the Strategic Science Investment Fund. That's just a big bucket of money that's focused on science capability building, so multi-year stable funding, largely through negotiation. So what that means is that the outcomes are determined aligned to national needs, as opposed to driven more principally through researcher ideas, although there is often a mix of those elements, and we'll come to that. Essentially, it requires wide participation, multiple organisations and capabilities coming together, and there's an obligation on the host to provide the arrangements to enable that, and all of that driving towards this natural hazards mission. Sitting around that in a bit more detail in terms of the scope and scale and the nature of the platform. So it is multi-hazard. In reality, that means the geological and meteorological hazards largely, but then we may well push the boundary, I guess, of that over time. It is new knowledge, but also science capability. So we are required to think about how the research investment builds critical capability, maintains, but also new requirements for capability over time. So there's that future focus. Very much a New Zealand Inc. approach. So it's not just funding to the host to decide. There's a collective agreement about what priorities and needs are linked to the resilience system. And allied to that is really the opportunity to drive a wider set of kind of benefits and reach through that engagement. A principal feature is the need to work closely with research users, and I'll come to what that processes look like for us. In the QuakeCoRE context, you'll be familiar with this in terms of identifying national and user needs, which really set the framework for prioritising research. And then now this new explicit requirement for us to stand up a function to enable better coordination of science when something big happens in the natural hazard context. Sitting around that, as this isn't from MB, this is capturing, I guess, some themes that emerged through consideration in the closeout of the National Science Challenges. All of the 11 National Science Challenge directors got together and thought about how do we capture the lessons and what are the key features which we see as driving future mission, or as is labelled here, purpose-led research, meaning research with a focus on delivering to some national strategic objective or goal. So that focus on public good, recognition of the scale and complexity often of those national goals, requiring people to work across boundaries. What do we mean by that? It's the boundaries between organisations, so institutional, but also across disciplines, in between science, policy, and practice. So it's everybody stepping out of their own spaces essentially to work in the collective space. That requires collaboration. So the focus on what we do to unify, and then recognizing that in working in those ways, so multidisciplinary, interinstitutional, working with users, focused on those national public good goals, there's a bunch of wider benefits that accrue for the science as well as for the strategic goal that might be the focus for the mechanism, and in our case, that's national focus. So we've been on this sort of accelerated journey over the last few months in particular. Things really didn't kick off in earnest until we'd closed out the Resilience National Science Challenge, and that wasn't until the end of September. And then we initiated a bunch of stuff to bring together some advisory functions and then to think about the process for engaging. Hopefully many of you on the call were connected in some way to that. The focus before the end of the calendar year, so leading up to December, were workshops with users in particular, communities, agencies, iwi Māori, to get a sense of what those national goals were. And I'll put up where that got us to in terms of a sort of a framework of outcomes. And we had to deliver that as an output to MB before Christmas. At the same time, we were trying to get a little bit of money out the door to support what were originally called Fast Start grants that you might have heard about. The process wasn't particularly fast, so I suggested we call them capability retention. And I'll speak to some areas of support that that's gone to. And then soon after the summer break, I was back into more engagement with more of a focus on what are the science questions, I guess, that relate to the high level outcomes. We had hundreds of post-it notes, probably hundreds of butcher sheet pages as well, lots of really valuable input from participants in those workshops. We did some things online as well. There's also some targeted engagement through our Rangapu Rangaho, our collective of Māori researchers that are deeply connected to iwi and hapu, and also some engagement through the National Iwi Chairs Forum. We took all of those inputs and using a design team, and I'll come to some membership of that, in the space of just a few weeks, had to synthesize all of that and turn out the platform plan. This is a formal MB requirement. Essentially, it's the multi-year strategy for the program. We hope to put a public version of that on the website shortly. And then just the last few months or few weeks, that plan's been evaluated, it's been approved, and now we're sort of stepping into the next phases, including appointing leadership into some areas. And I can speak a little bit to that in subsequent slides. So just back to the engagement process, can't remember the total numbers, but there's certainly in the several hundreds in total across the multiple sessions that we had. It was sort of an open door, open invite policy, really strong engagement. There's some concerns around the time frame that we were working under, but I think things went pretty well in spite of the sort of the rushed nature of some of the engagement, and really appreciate the considered input that we got through those processes, and we built some new connections also along the way, which has been great. So this is the outcomes framework, or at least a part of it, that I referenced. I won't spend too much time on this. It was really just to kind of highlight some key words really that speak to the areas of focus, because it's the framework on the basis of which the strong sentiment that came through and evidence from users around really where the valuable research focus was going to be. Those of you familiar with intervention logics or similar frameworks of this kind will recognize this is just the sort of top part of it. So beneath this is all the research activity that lead to these outcomes. But I just wanted to pick up on some kind of key themes. You'll see some of the bubbles or boxes in there relate to science capability. So there's stuff about science talent and emerging leadership. So that is a component of what we're focusing on. There are boxes in there that speak to collaboration and coordination required across the system, within research and between research, policy and practice, reference to the Ao Māori inputs and iwi Māori participation, and then elements which speak to the science knowledge, but also the know-how elements, so the application of that new knowledge, and then the resilience goals, which are the things that emerge sort of higher up as a result of those inputs from the collective actions and the science contribution. So the ambition is big and the scale and complexity is significant. These are some fairly ambitious goals in terms of the kind of societal transformation or system change that we're seeking to influence. But we know they're the right things to focus on in terms of the big gnarly challenges in risk reduction and response and recovery. And there's a version of this which will be updated on our website if you want to spend a bit more time. These kinds of frameworks are your thing. So yeah, we issued an expression of interest earlier in the year. These are the people that participate in that process in a fairly, again, intense period of a couple of weeks. We had a retreat of a couple of days and then online interaction to kind of build out the plan. It seemed to be a really effective process and lots of diversity of views, I think, that we got input to. MB have sought some balance from us in terms of connections to the resilience challenge, as well as push from us to kind of bring in new voices into that process as well. So we're looking for a bit of that balance. So this is where all of that got us to, and I'll step through the components of this, but I'll just kind of splash up the text summary of that. And thanks to Alice Lake Hammond for the graphic design on this. Those of you familiar with AO8 will get the design ethos from it. Influence this. We really appreciate your input. I think it really helped us sell the nature of the program to the evaluation panel for the plan. So at the centre there, the sort of twisted ribbon, if you like, around the map and part of New Zealand, living with risk, better resilience decisions, next generation risks assessment. Those are the kind of core science themes. Living with risk is really places people at the centre of risk reduction and resilience, very much focused on social science in terms of the science components there. The ambition is that work will drive a move to a more holistic or whole of society approach, integrating across sectors and with communities, and also to increase capacity around adaptation, response, and equitable recovery. Big focus on recovery across all three themes, actually. That's a really strong input from the users. Better resilience decisions is, we could sort of think about that as the regulatory environment, so choices that are being made in terms of land use planning and the built environment. We'll be working at that interface between society and people in the living with risk area, and the inputs on a more quantitative level from the risk assessment theme. And there'll probably be some sub-themes there across those components of land use planning and the built environment, and also a strong recovery focus in that one as well. Next generation risk assessment, that's really the quantitative engine, we think, of the program overall. So that's really about understanding hazard processes, new methods and methodologies, and quantifying the multiple range of hazards, and also the multi-hazard context, cascading, coincident, consequential, all those things. A really strong theme that emerged from users in the workshops was around better utilisation of existing data and information. So we think there'll be a big focus on that consistent and comparable use of hazard and risk information. And I'll come to some priority projects, some early areas that we want to focus on in that regard. And we see that theme is really sort of strongly underpinning the other two more qualitative themes, if you like. Interwoven with those core science themes is Vision Mātauranga, or He Waka Manawaroa program, and data and enabling technology. And I'll speak to aspects of He Waka Manawaroa in a moment. Data and enabling technology, that emerged as a kind of a key opportunity, I guess, for the program. I think it's also an area where there'll be some really useful partnering and alliancing with QuakeCoRE over time, given the progress that you guys have made in that regard. And probably the early stages of that program will be scoping, how we want to build capability in that space, while also in service of the kind of science priorities across those core themes, and expecting the Vision Mātauranga to be across all of those things as well. In terms of the other parts of the diagram, so sitting around those core science or research components, if you like, what we're calling enabling functions, so the stuff that we do to deliver value for both the research that's been done and also its implementation or application. So we've got post-event science, or learning from events. We've got knowledge mobilization, hazard and resilience, research alliances, and resilience catalyst hub. I'll speak in a bit more detail about the science coordination, but essentially that's going to be our quite a focus for us as a distinctive function, and both the planning for that as well as the work that we do when something happens. And we've kind of broadened that out into the context of learning from events. This is a really strong theme that came through in the workshops from users about not just capturing, but really the opportunity to drive application of those lessons, and the opportunity to make better use of existing information in that regard. Knowledge mobilization is really our science communication outreach and engagement component, so supporting those pathways to implementation. Impact is a really central driver for this program. It's probably a slight distinction, I guess, with QuakeCoRE, which has a little bit more of an emphasis on science excellence. The platform has that as well, but we're really measured principally on the basis of the impact that we have. So the changes in the system through the application of the science. So that's a big focus in terms of how we enable that. And I can speak in more detail, or if there's any questions. The research alliances, really this speaks to recognition that the scale and complexity of the mission requires ambition beyond this platform. The platform is just one part of the system, QuakeCoRE another. There are other investments, programs, endeavour, research projects, the work that you might individually been doing. So there's a wider system. And so recognition that some stewardship, coordination, connection across that system is going to be better for everybody. And we're being looked to, I guess, in part, to provide a little bit of that glue, really, and to support that cooperation. Partly at one level, that's just about everybody being in sight of each other, but also the opportunity is how we can collectively support more capability, more resourcing, and to be more effective in our own areas through that collective approach. So that's a really exciting soft mandate, I guess, that has emerged through the engagement. And then lastly, Resilience Catalyst Centre, or Resilience Catalyst Hub. This essentially is a bit of a concept around using the platform as a little bit of a shop front into that system. And it comes about through experiences in the Resilience National Science Challenge, especially the last 18 months or so. We were getting requests for connection to the system, being asked to kind of bring science capability together and also deliver solutions in some cases for things that agencies needed. And so we're looking at how we can kind of set that up as a slightly more structured area to support the emerging opportunities that we know, and also responding to requirements in the system, especially from central government. I won't linger too long on this. It's sort of probably not of great interest to a research-focused audience, but just recognising sort of structure and oversight arrangement. So this is where it's a little bit different from the National Science Challenge in the sense that there isn't independent governance. The host has responsibility for making decisions, but they look to input from independent groups for advice. And so we've had this combination of internal and external components, an establishment team that's drawn on resource capability people from the tail end of the Resilience Challenge, but also contributions from GNS and NIWA, and then that larger platform design team that was so critical for getting us to those sense of the areas of focus that we saw in the last diagram. That's evolving in implementation to having an oversight group in the new public research organisation, Earth Sciences New Zealand, but a similar construct. They will be responsible for decision making. And then what's called a steering group, but is still an advisory group of independent people. We're looking to stand up a panel of international scientists relevant to natural hazard resilience to inform excellence and implementation of science and those science programs in which there'll be leaders. There was an expression of interest issued for the leadership of those programs. We're just working through the tail end of some protocols around that. I had hoped to be in a position to, following any sort of formal announcement, to speak to that, but hopefully we'll get there in the next while. Just sort of touching on a little bit more detail, and want to acknowledge the great work which has progressed this really effectively in the last wee while with the collective, the Rangapu Rangaho, plus inputs from the National New Chairs Forum and others, and landed on, there seems to be some great good agreement in terms of the approach, partnership approach at multiple levels, connections with the EU Chairs Forum, but also at community-driven level in terms of iwi and hapu. The philosophy in terms of the approach here, very much looking to embed aspects of this work across all the other themes. A big capability and development aspect here in terms of supporting emerging capability and leadership through the program, and building off capability and lessons, I guess, from under the National Science Challenges in terms of the centering this in a Māori kaupapa. That is very much the intent, and acknowledging that the challenges, I guess, in the current context of progressing some of that. Just a little bit more detail here, and this will probably still evolve, but that group have sort of landed on 4 key areas which will provide a bit of a focus for research projects through the program. But it's likely to evolve over time. Just touching briefly back on the retention project, so you've got a bit of a sense of areas of activity underway. There was some guidance from MB in terms of areas of investment focus, which sort of made the decisions for us in a way. And then we had some really helpful input from the Establishment Advisory Group, which focused in on, I guess, the opportunity for supporting early career researchers, and in particular those that had come to the end of funding through the wind down of the National Science Challenges and were likely to be a valuable contributor to the new program. So the majority of projects you see listed here involve postdocs and PhD students and other early career researchers. A component of that funding, which MB has sort of ring-fenced us, is also money that we might need in case something happens, a big event, which we need to mobilise support before we're fully funded programs. So the post-event function, essentially. Okay, speaking now, I guess, to what's ahead of us in terms of that initial stage of implementation, hoping to bring that leadership team together in the next wee while, and my ambition is that they will really lead the process to build out the design across those 5 themes and program areas. there'll be a mix of open and more targeted sessions through that. The programs are likely to involve a mix of multi-year teams and also shorter term projects. This is going to be a bit different from the Resilience Challenge in the sense that they're not going to be sort of invested as a plateau of funding for a chunk of time. There's likely to be projects coming and going. There'll be chances to be involved in the long term. There'll be chances to kind of step in and out. There'll be a chance to kind of for new entrants essentially over time. And there'll be evolving leadership as well. And there'll probably be co-leadership opportunities emerge through those processes as well. We wanted to bring those teams together really to support the identification and emergence of co-leadership options rather than prescribing that from the get-go. At the same time, we'll be standing up these enabling functions. The priority is really on that post-event coordination because we're going to need that sooner rather than later. We're kind of doing it now at a low level for recent weather events. And we'll also be looking to contract some early work defined in the platform plan as well. And then, unlike the Resilience Challenge, the funding's not all going to be committed in one go. There will be opportunities for students and others to participate through contestable and also RFP processes targeted to the goals of those programs. Speaking to those priority projects, and these are all preliminary and not comprehensive, I just pulled out some that might be of interest. That really big focus in terms of better utilisation of existing data and information, sense of frustration in users around our ability to understand and make decisions in terms of the hazardscape that was reflected in the kind of North Island severe weather events in 2023 and the recovery processes there. So we've got, I think there's a lot of willingness to really make some progress in that regard. Some of those capability retention projects are contributing to this. And we'll probably try and get underway with that, the third one on that list, ahead of sort of fully forming programs probably. The other two there, out of the other themes, really capturing those lessons and driving that into, I think there's an opportunity in terms of national policy around some of these things that we can look to get ahead of, and that focus on a recovery context at the same time standing up vision marker on that in the data programs. Okay, just a little bit more consideration of this post-event science coordination. What do we really mean by that? This is not a kind of a first responder role for the platform by any means, and it's also not the platform looking to kind of take on and do everything. It's very much an enabling and sort of stewardship function in a way, but recognition that there is this opportunity in events to capture data, understand from a science and research perspective, and that is also valuable for later in response and into recovery and consideration of the lessons for risk reduction and resilience for the future. So that's kind of frames it in a broad sense. We're working through with NEMA and MB exactly what the scope is, because I've been involved in these events and really sensitive to the potential scale, the all-consuming nature of potentially of this as a function. We want to be clear about the broader science system not being everything that we take on, so very much having that science and hazard scope, recognising that there are capabilities outside of the platform that will require kind of connecting to. QuakeCoRE is obviously going to be, has been in the past and will be in future, especially earthquake, but probably other kind of land stability and other impacts. So there'll be some opportunity for partnership in that regard. Lots of requirements in terms of data sharing and information management, and we're potentially taking on quite a bit there. So we're just working through that progressively to understand exactly how much capacity we have. But yeah, really, I think this is a big opportunity for the wider system now that we've been given this more formal mandate by MB. NEMA really excited by it, I think, because it's going to helpfully connect in with, and there might be others on the call that can speak to this, sort of evolving partnership between science and CM. I think this really speaks to the trajectory, the pathway we've been on, not developing in that regard. Speaking of partnership or participation, just wanted to give a bit of a flavour of the opportunities that lie ahead. So there will be these more detailed and deeper design processes in those themes and programs. Some of those will be slightly targeted, others will be open, and that's going to be over the next, certainly in this calendar year, and there'll be iterations of that over time as well. So there's probably going to be theme and program regular workshops that not just funded researchers can participate in, very much looking to keep the tent flaps up where it makes sense to do so. Participation in the process around standing up that post-event function, we're really looking for getting a wider understanding of what that looks like and recognising there'll be potentially lots of people ultimately involved in that. So we're wanting to, there'll be opportunities there in that regard. Similarly with the priority projects, we're looking forward to probably from 2026 having an annual researcher meeting. Because of COVID, we never quite got there on a regular basis with the Resilience National Science Challenge. So we want to kind of set up that pattern early on, as well as probably not on an annual basis, maybe it's every 2 or 3 years, a bigger user stakeholder partner focused, sort of more impacts focused rather than researcher focused, a bit like our symposium in May in 2024 in the closeout of the Resilience Challenge. There will be future funding rounds, so everything's not going to be locked up through the program design. That'll be students as well as other researchers. And we're also looking in terms of the broader capability at how we can support the community of student and early career researchers. And I think there's some partnership opportunities there, QuakeCoRE. Which I think brings me to my final slide. I'm actually meeting with Santiago this afternoon, and we haven't actually, we've been speaking in kind of broad terms around this. Really keen to see how QuakeCoRE and the new platform can work together. I think there's a real opportunity, given all the shared interests, for us to be kind of working in mutual support, essentially. The platform couldn't exist without QuakeCoRE, and so we're really we'll be looking to support whatever the ambitions are for QuakeCoRE in terms of future funding. But also, there's a deep history here of joint funding. Students on the call or in the past would probably have had experience of funding components from the Resilience Challenge as well as QuakeCoRE and others. Often those things only happen because bits of money gets mobilised. David Johnson was really effective at that. And I think that's all useful future partnership in terms of how we bring money together, resources together to make those sorts of things happen. So I think I might leave it there and stop sharing. And if any of that made sense, happy to take questions. Kia ora.
Awesome. Thanks very much for that, Richard. It's difficult to summarize that amount of information and what's coming next in that short period of time, but I think did a really good job there. And thanks on behalf of the audience for running through where things are going and all the opportunities that lie ahead.